Hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk, Running a Cannabis Testing Lab, the roadmap to prepare for an ISO 17025 audit start with the LIMS. So here I am. My name is Aaditya Aeron. I'm working as the LIMS implementation expert with cloudlims.com. And today I'd be walking you through all the steps, all the requirements, everything that you need to know regarding making your lab an accredited one. Okay. So we'll be covering what is exactly this accreditation like and what is it involved and what are its requirements? And then why does your lab really need it? I mean, I know you understand that, cannabis testing laboratory is, it's like an emerging business. It's got a huge market, but why exactly? What all are the other, points that you need to make sure for your journey in becoming a success? Moving on, we'll also discuss how can you achieve it? What are these steps? If do you need any documentation for this entire accreditation process, or is there any other body selection that you can make, or what's your software and hardware tool here, if you like to understand that as well. So let's start understanding what is this accreditation really like. So the ISO 17025 is actually one of the biggest and by far the largest and most critical and important accreditation standard, which is a part of ISO. So ISO has about 20,000 standards overall, of which ISO 17025 is being practiced by about 100,000 labs already across the world. Now you've got a lot of parts where you need to, you can understand the nitty-gritties of, the ISO 17025 accreditation. So for example, the accreditation has a scope where you as a lab would have to inform the accreditation body what all are your services that you offer, or what all are the parameters on which you would be performing the testing. What is the scope of your work? Do you also, do you perform like a full panel test, or are you only into potency testing or residue solvent testing, etc.? So you'll have to tell the accreditation body at the time of applying for the ISO 17025 accreditation. You would also need to know about the normative references, which the ISO accreditation actually loops in, which makes it this indispensable one. Also, you've got terminologies, you've got definitions in place. You've also got the structural, the process, the organization, and the management requirements, which you need to kind of fulfill in order to, in one shot, get accredited by the accreditation body. So what's new really in the ISO IEC 17025? So in 2017, there was an update which was released, and it had about 4 important points, starting with the first quadrant where we've got risk-based thinking it's shown. So this basically gives you an idea of wearing a black hat when you actually analyze your laboratory's, future. So you need to take care of all, the types of analysis you will be performing, all the types of equipment you would be utilizing. Do you have the adequate guides in place so that you don't leave any stone unturned, and you can basically clear every part of the audit processes and become a successfully accredited lab. Next is the scope, where it was revised. So earlier, your labs were only required to comply or rather fulfill the testing and calibration techniques, but now even the random sampling techniques need to be taken care of. So for example, there was a time when the growers or the manufacturers who were about to send you their samples for testing, they would kind of handpick the best ones from the lot. I mean, they may have tainted samples as well. They may have, samples which are not maybe grown in the adequate environmental conditions, and perhaps they may be, not up to the mark. But just so that they can get by this entire milestone, they would send you their favorite, their most competitive, their perfect sample to the laboratory, and the sample can't do anything but to, of course, generate the best results because it's the correct sample that they're sending it to. So the changes that the laboratories need to actually go out and perform random sampling techniques so that they remove any scope of errors or manipulation here. We've got terminologies introduced. Let's say we've got a new definition for laboratory, Finally, you can see in the image showing the computer that this actually acknowledges the inclusion of a LIMS system, which means that you'll have electronic records taken care of, you'll have all the documents being controlled properly, all your lab technicians can remotely access the notebook on which they need to make entries and keep the entire workflow requirements in place so that all the team members are informed at all times. Next, you can see the why. So why are you really interested in getting a lab accredited to the ISO 725 accreditation? So the reason behind this is if you're already in a region where you've got legal requirements. I mean, if you live in a state or town where it's mandatory for you to fulfill, the legal requirements. I mean, it's required by the ruling bodies or the government of that particular region. So of course, you have no other option but to, comply with the ISO 17225 accreditation. Next is the enhanced lab credibility. So there are a lot of growers, manufacturers, or extractors out there who have a ton of options to send their samples to the laboratory of their choice. So we would rather suggest that you make your laboratory such a laboratory that they kind of want to collab and work with you, because it not only makes you earn credibility, it also guarantees that you follow the correct procedures and you also would be generating correct results, which eventually would make you a more serious lab testing, sample testing laboratory in your region, and also across your nation. So next up is the lower cost of operations. So for example, if you take a case where you receive a set of samples and you're working on them, and when the results are generated, you realize that your equipments were not calibrated. So you'll have to redo the entire process because you at one point did not know whether or not your equipment is in place to perform the test. Or let's say if your documents that you're referring to, the documents that your lab technician is referring to are not validated properly. So maybe you would have to do everything all over again. So therefore, doing the same task over and over again not only consumes time, but it would also add to your increasing overhead expenses. And finally, reduce risks and liabilities. So cannabis testing market is a very litigious industry, I would say, and it actually has a lot of risks associated with it. And you need to make sure that you don't get caught in any lawsuit. So at all times, regardless of you, being at any, location, you should try to get your lab accredited with the ISO 725 accreditation. So here is a map that actually shows you all the states where cannabis testing is, all the states where ISO 17225 is legally required for testing cannabis. Now you can see right from medical status of legalization in Maryland or Ohio till the recreational purposes in California or Nevada. You've got this map which would serve you to know to what extent is actually the legal requirement spreading, and it's gaining momentum across the United States. So you would want to make sure, depending on your region in the map, you would like to check with your local and state bodies and make your lab fulfill all such requirements. So with regards to the lab credibility to manufacturers, now, like I said, you would want to be a laboratory that is known for its integrity. It's known for the protocols that it follows. It's known for the accuracy in test results. And therefore, the people out there who are, in terms of B2B, your customers, your target audience, they are basically the manufacturers or the growers or the extractors. So you would want to get their attention and you would want to be liked by them, thereby earning their business and growing your business overall. So what really reduces the operational cost of the lab? We kind of touched upon it briefly, but if you look at it, the entire workflow starts from you receiving a test request, and then you uploading the test results, you generating the COVs, you kind of sending the test for validation as well, and measurement traceability plays a critical role. So in case of a scenario where your technician was maybe not qualified to perform a particular test, so this person will of course, generate inaccurate results. Next comes the productivity. The productivity is, of course, if you've got a reagent or an inventory which is beyond its expiration date, and you don't have a system like LIMS in place, which gives you no alerts. So you're going to run your test using an expired inventory, which of course would end you up in generating inaccurate results. Now, with the quality assurance and quality control, you've got QC sample tests. You've got a set of technical procedures and documentation, or a set of protocols which need to be followed. And all these parameters combined, all these checkpoints combined, would either make you spend more doing the same job and also kind of not being successful at it, or you can just turn the table towards you and lead your way by lowering the cost, increasing the productivity, increasing the quality, and of course generating the accurate results every single time. So now this is the main, I would say, concern of late, because it's an industry which doesn't have any federal oversight per se. So you would want your lab to be protected, not only from the external parties trying to falsely accuse you, maybe, but also internally, if you don't want to fail any audits which are conducted on surprise, or maybe like a surprise visit by the auditors. So what you can do here is you can basically make sure that you've got all the documentation in place. Your staff is properly trained on the kind of tests they are supposed to conduct, and in case someone files a case, kind of tries to sue you if they're kind of trying to lodge a lawsuit against you. So what you can do is, in your LIMS system, you can take them back from the very starting point of things, which starts from the correct environmental conditions in which the test was conducted and the correct sample amount that was accessioned to the system, or you have your correct people working on the said testing. You've also got already predefined SOPs, which can of course guide technicians to take the right actions. And then finally, you've got measurement traceability, which further kind of assures the person filing, or rather investigating the matter, that you've actually got everything in place, and therefore the results that you generated are 100% genuine and they're correct. So you can actually defend yourself from such uninvited trouble. So far, we covered the what of ISO 17025 and then why do you need it. Now let's discuss how can you really go through this entire process and get accredited. So there are some key requirements, like I categorized them broadly, right from process to structural to general, the technical, and the management requirements. So let's go over them very briefly. And what you can see on my screen is confidentiality of information being discussed. So you've got, you've got a large amount of people on your team, let's say, and you're working with partners, and you're working with the other people who might want to access the same batch of samples and check for various other pieces of information. So you want to make sure that your confidentiality is maintained at all times. You don't want to overdo or underdo entering of information. So it might just end up in wrong hands, and your test results might get manipulated tomorrow. So this is important. Now you've got your organization with multiple people, having their roles and responsibilities predefined. So you would like to make sure that only the people who've got a particular right or access are able to perform a particular task. Now, a LIMS should actually facilitate you to make the selection. So on my screen, you can see an image where you've got various profiles created. Now you've got a manager profile, or a technician profile, or a lab in charge profile. And for each of the dedicated modules on this LIMS, you've got various actions that can be taken care of. So you want to make sure that you make the right selection for what kind of a person can be allowed to perform what kind of an action. Now comes the resource requirements, where you've got a personnel and you've got purchasing services and supplies, embedded in it. So you've got personnel, which means you've got, like I've mentioned earlier, you've got various types of people at various roles in the team. And maybe it's only the lab manager who needs to have access to all parts of the product. Also, maybe Sam is, let's say Dr. Sam is competent to perform potency tests, whereas maybe Dr. Susie's, competent enough to perform only the homogeneity test. So you need to make sure that your personnel is trained on the correct activity, and it's only them who work on the said task, so that you of course can assure the correct pattern to be followed and correct test results to be generated. The purchasing of services and suppliers, you actually work with various vendors out there, and so you need to make sure the reagents or the inventories that you're receiving are actually up to the mark, so that they play a vital role in the overall evaluation of your test results. Now, the LIMS should be able to track and maintain all the records of the people on your team with regards to maintaining their competence, the trainings that they've already passed or are being currently conducted. And along with these statuses, at the time of assigning a test request from the LIMS, your lab manager or your lab admin can basically see whether or not Sam or Susie is the right person for the potency test. So with all the inventories that you have in your lab, you can actually associate barcodes to them. You can then kind of associate all the critical pieces of information to all these barcodes. And you can make sure that you also keep track of their expiration dates and their depleting levels. So if in case you want to restock, you can set an alarm on the LIMS for yourself so that you can restock well in time. And you can also accept the request as and when you receive, and you keep earning more business from your potential customers. Also, like you can see on the screen, you've got a hydrochloric acid on the top row, which is already expired. Therefore, at the time of association agent to a particular test, you would be notified and you would not be able to associate it with the said test, which is eventually enabling you to perform only the correct processes and not end up generating inaccurate test results. So now comes the process requirements, which starts from review of requests, tenders, and contracts. So at all times, you would want to be sure that you can accept only those requests which can be actually performed correctly and meticulously by your laboratory team. Maybe the equipment is currently not ready, or the concerned staff, let's say Dr. Sam for potency is not really available in his application, or perhaps your auditor or your validator is not currently available. So all in all, every critical part or rather minor part of the workflow in which some checkpoint is supposed to be taken care of, if that's not in place yet, you should not accept a test request that you receive. Also, it's kind of surprising that a lot of laboratories don't realize the importance of calibrating and maintaining their equipment. So it's a must, and your LIMS should actually facilitate it for you. Now, you should also be able to generate the COAs in your respective local and state regulation requirements and be able to share it with the said person. So for example, from California, when my customers basically, let's say, for example, operate from California, from the many other states that they operate from. So the Californian customers need to upload a copy of the COA to the BCC, Bureau of Cannabis Control, right at the time they first generate the COA. So your LIMS should also facilitate all of these functionalities, which actually make your journey of becoming a ISO 17025 accredited lab much easier and simpler. The test and calibration methods should basically, for example, let's say you're running a culture testing. So you should be able to backtrack and see which methods were validated and were they properly followed basis the documents also associated with them. Now, if in case you're running a batch of samples and the test results are maybe not up to the mark, I mean, as per your understanding of them by looking at them or maybe by investigating the matter a little further. So what you can also do is through measurement traceability, track the results of the batch of samples very much back to the QC sample. So now the QC sample may be a spike or a duplicate or a blank, let's say. So if your QC samples is really spiked, and if it's compared with the test results of the samples that you just tested, and if the batch of samples that you just tested say that it's not really spiked, so you can know that there is there is a difference between the results generated by QC sample, which implies it was spiked, versus the normal batch of samples. So of course, in this case, you can rectify and take some corrective actions here. And finally, you would like to ensure your quality of test results at all times, because that is what matters eventually. And all the steps that we've discussed so far is only for our aim to generate the quality test results. So just taking a look at the review of requests. Now here is a LIMS screenshot, which actually shows you all the details associated with this request. Now you've got a catalog in place. You've got some samples associated with it. You can see who was the person requesting this particular test to you and what is the turnaround time like. So if this is something you can do, you should go ahead, accept it, and assign this task to the correct technician in your team. Once the test results are uploaded onto your LIMS system, you should be able to get them validated, and your validator should basically be able to share some remarks and approve or reject the test, and leave me any comments by their understanding of whether or not the correct technical procedures were followed. With regards to the equipment, instrument, and calibration maintenance, of course, you can track all the components, because a lot of times these equipment have their individual components, and each component having its own set of tracking information. So you need to make sure that with the software that you use, it tracks not only your equipment information, maybe the agency you purchased it from, the vendor information, the calibration date and cycle, and the next calibration date, or let's say the previous one's status. Also being able to track all the component information, and eventually also assigning the correct personnel to perform a particular test on the concerned equipment only. So all such pieces of information needs to be in place, and that's what your LIMS should actually assist you with. The management of QC samples, like you can see on the screenshot, the one on the third row highlighted in green, that's a QC sample. And above that are two normal batch of samples. Now you can actually enter the test results for this QC sample, and then when you do it for the normal batch of samples, you can make the comparison and see if there is a deflection in the set of results that are entered on LIMS. And accordingly, you can your validator approve or reject the test, and you won't basically burn your money going further down by conducting or other regressing in an incorrect direction. So at this point, you can stop, restart, and generate the accurate results. Okay, so here is a custom survey. I mean, it's just one of these surveys which your LIMS can generate. I mean, it's completely configurable depending on, it should be configurable depending on what software you're using. Since you've got different states with different requirements of how a report should look like, your LIMS should do just that. So now let's talk about the ISO IC 17025's management requirements. So you've got control of records. So let's say you've got various people on the team, and you've got multiple user groups also. So you would not like a person from user group 1 to access documents or other information which has been created on the LIMS by a person from the user group 2. So therefore, you should always be able to make such pieces of information not only confidential, but you should also be able to track the transfer that has happened from hand to hand for any sample or test, for example. So maybe you've got a sample chain of custody and a test chain of custody as well. So if a sample moves from the grower's hand to the lab technician's hand to maybe some other body out there, so you would want to make sure that you've got all such pieces of information in place. And with regards to the test also, say let's say the test is entered or rather created by personnel 1, and then maybe the test is conducted by the other personnel, whereas the test is validated by the other person. So at all points, you have a different person controlling the test case. So you need to keep track of all your records and prevent them from any unauthorized access. The document control would actually allow you to upload documents to the system, and you should be able to maintain all the SOPs in place, all the other associated protocols which are, let's say, shared with you by the manufacturer of the equipment in your lab. You should be able to keep track and manage all such pieces of documents and data very efficiently. finally, you've got an internal audit requirement, which actually requires you to keep, log all the activities which are performed by all the lab personnel, right from the time they log in until they log out, along with the date and time stamp. So the software, the LIMS that you use should also allow you to log all the audit trails and the internal login activities, so that it also becomes like a part of the measurement traceability at times if you receive some uninvited trouble. So overall, it's going to help you get past that. Now here is a screenshot for the document control. You can actually track the document versions. Like you can see, there are 4 versions created, and the 4th version, let's say, is the latest version which your equipment manufacturer just told you about, and this is the one that now your technicians should follow. So you can replace the previously associated SOPs with particular tests for, maybe your personal trainer or particular type of procedure. You can now just redo that and update both your equipment and your personnel on the said SOP, so that, again, you fulfill the objective of accrediting with the ISO 725 regulation. So now comes the part where I can actually talk to you about how really can you start with this process. So you know about what the accreditation is, why is it really important, how do you achieve it, maybe you can utilize a LIMS there. But now really, how do you get to the very, basic of beginning? What do you do tomorrow after this talk is finished? What can you do that? So actually, ISO 70225 gives you a window of about 1 year also, so that you can maybe plan and apply and then execute, and then you can get better at it and finally receive an award certificate for that. So your first step actually becomes to lay out your entire plan and then pull in all the pieces of documentation that would be utilized, and then finally select the right set of software, run mock audits internally, apply for the accreditation and win it, and then maintain it. With a little more detail there. So your first step would actually become becomes for your quality management system documentation to be gathered. You can then share it with the ISO accreditation body, let's say A2LA, for example, and then they will review your documentation, basically your equipment that you're using, their technical processes that you've put in place, or your competence of the staff and the trainings that are conducted. So they would kind of review everything theoretically, and then they would pay an on-site visit to your lab, and they would evaluate of everything, whether or not it matches, and they would probably run a mock audit, and they would see if everything falls in place. If it does, they can let you know about any errors also, and you can then work on the corrective actions pertaining to the same. Once you're at this point and everything now looks good, you would receive a certificate for the accreditation, which you can now basically promote, or other, it's like an earning, it's like a very treasured achievement for you. So you need to make sure that you can also kind of perform the retest, so that, in the sense, you can kind of enroll yourself in any proficiency testing, so that once you've actually surpassed this process, you also retain the accreditation for years to come. So now let's assume that you've already achieved the accreditation. So now, of course, there are labs which may or may not necessarily need. So of course, there are labs which at this point have it mandatory in the region to get accredited with the ISO 17025. But maybe you're a laboratory who is just aspiring to be one of those good and very credible laboratories, and you just achieved your accreditation as well. So now how do you maintain it? So you would want to make sure that you've got all the reassessment evaluation processes in place. You want to do your research, and you would also like to take part in the proficiency testing, let's say the one organized or conducted by Emerald. So you'll have to, so basically random samples are sent to all the laboratories, and of course Emerald knows what the correct result is like, and all these laboratories are supposed to generate their results and share it back. And that would basically tell the system conducting the entire drill whether or not your lab is someone who can qualify these random surprise proficiency tests. And if it does, you can keep track of your internal audits also. You can have them conducted internally, regularly. You can strive for continuous improvement. You can stay updated with what is latest in the industry and what all has been updated in terms of the ISO 17025 requirements. And once that is done, you can also make sure that if ever you later on are willing to expand your business operations, let's say today, like I said, if you're only working on a potency test and tomorrow you're working on a full panel test, you're adding more feathers under the hood, or adding more feathers to the cap, sorry. So you can then let the accreditation body know, and you'll have to reapply for this new scope that you're now expanding into. So every activity, every service, every job that you're doing in the lab needs to be informed to the accreditation body, because if only you do that, you would earn an accreditation for each of the activities worked upon by your laboratory. Now, you've got enough of information about the what, the why, and the how, and the process, and what's the life after accreditation. But if we talk about the ground zero and what becomes your your intangible investment in the longer run, and how do you make the correct choice for that? So you have to actually understand the difference between a sample management software and a LIMS. So a sample management software is more of it's mostly required to track all the sample information, all the test information only, and generate pertaining reports. But when you talk about a full-fledged LIMS, it can actually do much more. It is the software you're looking for if you're someone aspiring your laboratory to be accredited to the ISO 17025 accreditation. So you would want a LIMS which does everything that a sample management software does, and additionally, it takes care of your lab inventory information. It takes care of your instruments calibration and maintenance. It takes care of your packages, which contain the samples which can be incoming to your lab or going out of your lab. You would want to perform sample prepping. You would want to take care of all the documents in place and keep track of your staff training and competence, and also generate trend analysis reports for any sample for a given period of time. So it's like a full-fledged, completely unified solution that is your go-to software when you think about ISO 17025. Which brings me to the final leg of the presentation, just concluding what all have we learned today. So we looked at why and what is ISO 17025. So of course, it's the single most important regulatory challenge out there, and you want to strive hard to learn everything about it and make your lab legally credible and also competitive in the market. Because even if you're really not ready for the accreditation right now, you can start tomorrow, and you've got at least a 1-year window. And tomorrow, when you're actually there, that's when you would earn more business in your region and across and beyond. And finally, you learned how a LIMS can make it easy for you. How is the process like? How can you actually retain the accreditation? How can you continually be an accredited laboratory in the eyes of the world? So that's all from my side for today. It was lovely having you, and that's all from my side. Thank you for being a lovely audience.